The quest for the ultimate spiritual life often begins in profound quietude, but what many found was a dangerous psychological pressure cooker. In the late 13th century, thousands of women, driven by devotion or necessity, accepted the eternal vow, trading the chaos of the world for the iron certainty of the cloister. These towering stone enclosures were intended as fortresses against contamination, sanctuaries where the soul could dedicate itself wholly to the divine. Yet, as history often reveals, any space built upon the total denial of human nature holds a fatal instability at its foundation, showing us how the architecture of holiness sometimes becomes a perfect, pressurized vessel for profound human failure, and how the very ambition for purity paradoxically sets the stage for catastrophic ethical collapse. Do you ever wonder what happens when absolute silence is mandatory? Step into the chilling stillness of the scriptorium, where the only light is a narrow, deliberate shaft angled through a high, leaded window, and the air is thick with cold and the subtle, sharp aroma of ink and suffering. Hours passed, bent over vellum, the rhythmic scrape of the quill the only permitted sound in the relentless silence. This forced sensory deprivation, intended to focus the mind on transcendent goals, often resulted in a devastating psychological reversal. The rigorous routine, the choreography of piety, eventually ceased to be a spiritual guide and became, instead, a suffocating, inescapable mechanism of control, underscoring the ancient pattern that eternal salvation, when tethered to absolute obedience, can feel more like a cage than a sanctuary. But this silence was not the peace of the spirit. It was a brittle, strained quietude that anticipated a breaking point, revealing a hidden side of monastic life. The monastic structure was not purely theological. It was deeply interwoven with the social and economic fabric of the medieval world, as many daughters of minor nobility, excluded from advantageous marriages, were effectively placed, along with substantial dowries, into these communities. This influx of wealth and high-born entitlement complicated the vow of poverty immediately. The subtle, unwelcome reality was that the world they had sworn to abandon had simply moved inside the walls with them, introducing complex power dynamics and a critical vulnerability to the entire system, proving that the roots of earthly ambition are surprisingly difficult to sever. As the 14th century dawned, the first soft tremors of decay became noticeable, often expressed through minor yet symbolically significant violations of the rule, prompting the question, what happens when forbidden passions find a new vocabulary? Consider the refectory, the hall of communal sustenance, where tradition demanded the reading of sacred scripture to sustain the soul. Instead, certain convents began to permit the reading of secular romances, tales of courtly love, adventure, and forbidden passion. These stories, smuggled past the watchful eye of the Mother Superior, provided a dangerous new vocabulary for longing. They planted a blueprint for emotions that the rigorous system was designed to extinguish, demonstrating that the appetite for earthly life, though suppressed, remained fiercely alive beneath the weight of stone and solemn vows. It's the small, material declarations that often signal the deepest resistance. Observe the subtle declarations of resistance appearing among the sisters. Perhaps a small, highly polished silver crucifix, far too ornate for the coarse monastic habit, is momentarily glimpsed, tucked within a sleeve. Such an object is not merely a piece of jewelry. It is a profound declaration of allegiance to a separate self, a sign of the internal schism, where the discipline that once felt like divine structure began to warp, slowly transforming into an oppressive, inescapable trap. We see a timeless pattern here, showing how extreme emotional and sensory deprivation, when maintained indefinitely, inevitably creates a vacuum where any form of release, no matter how forbidden, gains immense, destabilizing appeal. The core ritual focus of the cloistered life was the nightly office, requiring the nuns to rise in the deepest hours of the morning for prayer. But what if devotion became a perfect shield for illicit activity? Paradoxically, this period of profound darkness, intended for solitary devotion, often became a perfect shield for illicit activities. Reports filtered back to local bishops of doors left unsecured, visitors received after sundown, and boundaries blurring between the consecrated haven and the secular danger. The intentional obscurity meant to aid meditation instead became an accomplice to severe suffering and transgression. The spiritual violation was steadily, terrifyingly, becoming physical and institutional, revealing the deep vulnerability of systems that rely on absolute darkness for their function. Even the very uniform, the coarse, heavy wool habit, symbolizing humility and mortality, was itself subverted, making you wonder what secrets were held beneath the veil. In documented instances, expensive lace, rich silks, and clandestine jewelry were worn underneath the severe outer layers, a secret rebellion against the solemn vow of poverty. These acts were never mere vanity. They were symptoms of an internal schism, a rejection of the spiritual architecture holding their world together. The relentless pursuit of beautiful, hidden objects signaled a catastrophic shift in allegiance, away from the transcendental ideals of the community and back toward the insistent, demanding self, a tragic historical pattern of internal collapse. Jump forward 2 decades into the 1340s and discover how discipline in certain houses had slackened to a point that would have been unimaginable to the founding mothers. Picture the communal parlor, now filled not with the sound of chanted liturgy, but with raucous laughter, the clatter of dice, and the consumption of strong drink. Gambling, drinking, and even theatrical performances using the cloister as a private stage became shockingly commonplace. The rigorous separation from the external world, the defining rule of their entire existence, had effectively collapsed, proving that the fortress against sin had inadvertently concentrated the very thing it was designed to repel, a chilling reminder of how easily control can invert its purpose. The deepest, most devastating betrayal of the ritual life centered on the vows of perpetual chastity, forcing us to ask, what really happened when the walls came down? While official church records used deliberately euphemistic language, referring to scandals of the flesh or forbidden indulgence, the historical reality was starkly clear. The environment of enforced isolation and close proximity created conditions ripe for intense emotional and physical attachments, both among the sisters and externally with male visitors or priests. The historical record reveals that the violations of dignity were not always consensual, reflecting the stark power dynamics and the dangerous lack of external oversight inherent in these enclosed communities, a pattern of abuse that is tragically common when power is absolute. Imagine the chapter house, traditionally the location for spiritual correction and self-denunciation, instead devolving into a center of bitter infighting and factionalism, a place where piety itself became a weapon. Those sisters who desperately tried to maintain the original, stricter rule were often subtly persecuted, ostracized, or actively marginalized by the majority seeking liberty. The air became heavy, not with incense, but with resentment, fear, and secrecy. The mandatory silence was now weaponized, used not to facilitate prayer, but to hide fundamental institutional corruption, leading to the terrible realization that this destruction was profoundly self-inflicted, born from the psychological pressure cooker of absolute control. The spiritual authority of the Mother Superior in these declining houses often became purely nominal, enforced only by the looming threat of exposure rather than genuine respect or piety, raising the essential question: can mandatory devotion ever truly succeed? The system, initially intended to offer women education, spiritual status, and protection, had instead become a fertile ground for their ethical and psychological collapse. History consistently demonstrates that when devotion is mandatory, it is perpetually fragile, and when absolute control is enforced, human resistance will invariably find the darkest, most destructive corners in which to flourish, accelerating the pace of institutional ruin. What followed this internal fracture was the inevitable external consequence. direct, decisive intervention by the local bishop or, in the most severe instances, papal inquisitors, and the purge was swift. The external purge was swift and often brutal in its finality, designed not to cure the underlying human causes, but to maintain the Church's essential external facade of moral authority. When the corruption was deemed too deep-seated and scandalous, the actions taken were drastic, resulting in the condemnation of the entire community. The goal was simple: eliminate the source of contamination before the scandal spread further into the public consciousness. A powerful illustration of how institutions prioritize reputation over humanity. The Inquisitors' records often speak of prolonged suffering and public degradation imposed upon the most vocal or visible transgressors, demanding us to confront the brutal realities of the era. The silence that descended upon the houses following these interventions was profound and chilling, a silence not of spiritual peace, but of profound, enforced terror and institutional cleansing. Accounts of the dissolution of certain houses, particularly those documented in the Low Countries, reveal the terrifying speed of the shift, moving from small, forbidden indulgences to a total institutional purge, underscoring how quickly a sacred space can transform into a site of intense human conflict under the pressure of external judgment. Walk through the cold, echoing corridors after the intervention has concluded, and note how all vibrancy, color, and natural sound are gone. The few remaining sisters move like terrified shadows, and the strict rule is reimposed with an unforgiving iron hand, demanding absolute, unblinking obedience. But the damage was already done. The original purpose of the cloister, spiritual refinement, is irrevocably tarnished by the memory of profound, systemic ethical failure, helping us understand the inherent vulnerability of any human system that relies entirely on total isolation and the denial of fundamental emotional and social needs. The legacy of these documented downfalls proved to be tragically twofold, demonstrating how one century's failing informs the next. First, they provided relentless fodder for anti-clerical sentiment in the centuries that followed, offering potent historical evidence that fueled the criticisms of institutional corruption during the Reformation. Second, and more tragically, these scandals often led to the imposition of even more rigorous, oppressive controls upon future generations of women religious, effectively cementing the very conditions, extreme isolation, emotional deprivation, and lack of accountability that had instigated the original collapse. The history of the enclosed nunneries thus becomes a grim, repeating loop of human failing, followed by escalating draconian reaction. And we must ask what lessons we should take from this cycle. We look back upon these events not for the sake of sensationalism, but to clinically understand the acute pressure points inherent in historical structures of absolute power and suppression. The story of the cloister reveals that when the boundary between the sacred and the worldly is artificially rigid, the inevitable blending of the two can become explosively destructive, proving that the walls meant to keep the world out served only to fatally amplify the human frailty contained within. The true tragedy lies in the profound irony. The ambitious human quest for ultimate absolute purity so often leads directly to the most catastrophic, painful forms of corruption. The material evidence left behind by these condemned communities offers silent, powerful testimony to the severity of the institutional violations they endured and committed. And these fragile remains speak volumes where the written archives sometimes remain purposefully vague, hinting at the untold stories buried beneath official silence. Archaeological findings within the ruins of compromised convents frequently reveal small, unexpected, non-religious objects buried beneath floorboards or secreted within wall cavities, forcing us to try and read the history written in dust and silk fragments. These might include tiny mirrors, fragments of luxurious silk, or mundane tools repurposed for clandestine communication. And these artifacts paint a clear picture of individuals desperate to retain some connection to a personal identity and agency, battling against the overwhelming monolithic force of enforced monastic denial, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in total confinement. Consider the psychological landscape, where simple friendships transformed under pressure into deep, sometimes dangerously possessive emotional attachments, purely due to the complete lack of external outlets, making you realize the sheer intensity of life in the cloister. You can perceive the searing psychological intensity of being perpetually surrounded by the same faces, the same routine, day after day, year after year, with no possibility of escape or external validation. This environment became a severe emotional hothouse, ripe for both spiritual intensity and profound, complex breakdown, showing how isolation can turn devotion into psychological danger. The medieval perception of sound and silence played a crucial, often destructive role in the downfall, because silence was hailed as a spiritual virtue, yet it was also the perfect cloak for transgression. Confessionals, intended as instruments of cleansing and moral correction, were sometimes exploited for the secretive transference of private information or the subtle manipulation of those under the superior's control. The small, heavily grated windows used for these exchanges became, paradoxically, points of deepest vulnerability and illicit connection, underscoring the ancient truth that every boundary, no matter how sacred, is a point of potential failure. The Church struggled immensely to govern sins that were whispered, not shouted, making definitive proof nearly impossible until the situation had progressed to a state of catastrophic institutional disarray, leading to a breakdown of oversight. The inherent secrecy of the cloister shielded its internal suffering and decay from external oversight, allowing ethical fractures to deepen unnoticed until they demanded a public, painful purge. Accountability vanished within the high walls, replaced by a culture of mutual surveillance and terror, a textbook example of how a lack of transparency accelerates ruin. Even the sacred liturgy, the heart of their ritual life, was sometimes quietly subverted, forcing us to ask, how far did the rebellion truly go? Historical accounts exist of nuns deliberately altering traditional chants or injecting secular verses into the sacred texts during private services, a quiet but profound act of musical and ritualistic defiance against the imposed spiritual identity. This demonstrates that the rejection of the rule was often intellectual, emotional, and ritualistic, a deep, total rebellion against the very foundations of their mandated existence, proving that resistance finds its way into the most sacred of forms. You might uncover the letters of an abbess, written decades before a notorious collapse, warning the local bishop about the profound spiritual dangers of accepting too many novices whose commitment was purely social convenience, showing that not everyone was blind to the coming failure. Her accurate prophecy was ignored, yet she understood an essential truth. Enforced spirituality is inherently unstable. When commitment is not genuine, the sanctuary inevitably transforms into a social prison where forbidden indulgence becomes the only perceived route to momentary, dangerous freedom, a chilling foreshadowing of human tragedy. The issue of health and healing within the cloister adds another layer of grim complexity, particularly regarding how they managed anxiety and pain. Convents were centers of herbal medicine, and their proximity to powerful, sometimes mind-altering substances used for both medicinal and spiritual contemplation presented unique dangers. The lines blurred constantly between genuine healing, self-medication for profound anxiety, and the deliberate alteration of consciousness. This contributed to the atmosphere of moral ambiguity and severe psychological suffering that characterized the declining houses, complicating the historical record of transgression. Consider the altar itself, which in the most extreme documented cases of moral collapse speaks volumes about the level of disrespect and internal schism. Accounts speak of non-religious objects being placed or hidden near the sacred vessels. Love tokens, gambling chips, or bottles of strong wine. These items, juxtaposed against the consecrated symbols of devotion, powerfully embody the psychological intensity of the schism within the community. The sacred and the profane had not merely overlapped, they had violently merged, demanding the external, institutional cleansing that followed. Step back now from the immediate shock of the scandal and view the long arc of history, because the tragic ends of these compromised houses serve as a permanent caution. They remind you that no wall is high enough to exclude human fallibility, and no rule is strict enough to govern the unpredictable depths of the human heart when it is denied fundamental dignity and agency. The long shadows they left behind are essential for understanding the true human cost of historical power and systemic suppression, a timeless lesson for all rigid systems. The ruins of these convents still stand today in various corners of Europe, silent witnesses to the turbulent human drama played out within their confines. They remain monuments to the quiet historians who must piece together the fragments of intense pain, fierce devotion, and inevitable downfall, asking us to look deeper than just the visible stone. The moss grows over the broken stone, softening the edges of the tragedy. Yet the memory of the profound suffering endured by the women caught in this historical current remains sharply etched in the archived records, waiting to be understood. This examination is created for educational and historical purposes, carefully analyzing themes of power, corruption, and human conflict through objective interpretation. Ultimately, the medieval convent system, at its worst, was a devastating demonstration of how high ambition and the pursuit of holiness could be warped by systemic failure and the enforcement of extreme isolation. The downfall was not a sudden accident, but a slow, inevitable outcome of intense psychological and social pressures compressed into a physically inescapable space, leading us to understand that if this raised more questions than it provided answers, history still has deeper truths to reveal about the cost of absolute control.